Welcome back, everyone. Hope you guys had a great weekend. Had a little time off from recording over the weekend other than a couple of streams. There is going to be a live stream for patrons and members coming this week, probably on Wednesday. It was supposed to be yesterday. Didn't happen. It's definitely happening this week. In the meantime, we are going to be continuing our look at some of the events of the Great War, World War I. That's what we're going to do today. And in the very near future here, probably later on this week, we're going to dive back into some of the Napoleonic Wars with Epic History TV. Many of you have been asking for that for a long time. So it's coming. And of course, we will continue our Antietam series, some original content from the battlefields of Antietam. My friend JD at the History Underground has begun his part of that series. He's looking at things from a slightly different perspective. We were there together, shared an Airbnb, and just had an amazing time making content for our channels together with a little help from our friend Gary Edelman from the American Battlefield Trust as well. Now, for today, we're going to dive into World War I from the American perspective from the Armchair Historian. Been a while since we have taken a look at his channel. As always, a link's in the description to the original content if you want to check not only this video out, but all of his other fantastic content. He's a young guy, really knows what he's talking about, does great research. Also has a really cool game out right now, Fire and Maneuver. Check that out if you get a chance. I'll probably play it on my gaming channel at some point. Here we go. All right, so it looks like we're going to dive right into the Battle of Belleau Wood if we're looking at June 2nd, 1918. Not the first time that the U.S. saw combat in Europe during World War I, but certainly the first that most people talk about in terms of memorable action. So let's see what this is all about.
Captain Lloyd W. Williams can hear the sounds of combat. Men of the 5th Marine Regiment pick their way through Belleau Wood, newly arrived to reinforce their flagging French and British allies. Suddenly, forms come bursting from the thick woods. The Marines raise their rifles, but instead of Stahlhelmed Germans, they find their lines swamped by battered French infantry. As their comrades retreat through the American line, a French colonel approaches Captain Williams, but his English is broken and unintelligible. The French officer gives a snort of frustration and pulls a notepad from his kit, scribbling a note. Captain Williams reads the proffered order before fixing his bayonet, uttering 6 words that will echo through the history of the United States Marine Corps. Retreat? Hell, we just got here.
Love that.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. George Washington, founding father and first president of the United States.
Griffin, we need to talk, buddy. Why is Woodrow Wilson on your wall behind you? I know, I get it. He was the president during World War I. So many things we could have put on the back of the... Anyway, let's go on.
Famously advised the young country not to involve itself in foreign affairs. Few presidents seemed to take this advice to heart like Woodrow Wilson, who commented before his inauguration that it would be ironic if his presidency was concerned mainly with matters abroad. President Wilson's remarks would prove prophetic, as he was the anti-war isolationist who led the United States into the First World War. In this video, we will examine how the US went from a country that simultaneously declared neutrality but supplied the Entente to a major partner in the destruction of the Central Powers.
And he makes a great point there, and that's a point that I've made before, is that everybody talks about the neutrality of the United States, but we really weren't as neutral as we claimed. We were militarily neutral, but not economically neutral. Never were.
For military historians, it often isn't enough to simply read about battles, soldiers, or campaigns. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, then a piece of memorabilia or a prized collectible is worth a whole shelf of books. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce the sponsor of today's video, Goat Guns, the producers of high-quality, die-cast, miniature-scale model firearms. Ranging from 4 to 15 inches in length, Goat Guns models are designed to be as accurate as possible to their functional counterparts,
that's cool.
up to and including authentic wooden finishes and leather shoulder straps. This makes designs like the iconic M1 Garand or Thompson submachine gun stand out all the more, while little details like detachable magazines, moving parts, and dummy rounds add a sense of realism that no plastic model could hope to match. I was especially thrilled with the models I received. Ordering is easy, and you get a 10% discount if you order a bundle of 3 models, and a 20% discount when you order 10. Support our channel by clicking the link in the description below and start building your own Goat Guns collection today.
There he is.
Safe behind its twin moats of the Atlantic and Pacific, the United States watched the development of the First World War with concern. When hostilities broke out in July of 1914, American ambassador to France, Myron T. Herrick, advocated taking an active role in mediation. Expression from our nation would have great weight in this crisis. A strong plea for delay and moderation from the President of the United States would meet with the respect and approval of Europe.
And this wouldn't have been a new idea. It wasn't too many years before this that Theodore Roosevelt received the Nobel Peace Prize for his involvement in the negotiations surrounding the Russo-Japanese War. So there is precedent for this for the United States. So I'm not going to give Wilson too much grief for wanting to get involved in the affairs of other nations, because there is a precedent for that. And it's kind of interesting, too, that Theodore Roosevelt has both a Medal of Honor for action in wartime, but also a Nobel Peace Prize.
President Wilson called for neutrality on an existential level, exhorting all Americans to observe neutrality in thought and in deed.
And this is one of the things that really kind of, I guess, always rubs me the wrong way about Woodrow Wilson, and I know it's kind of become like almost a meme on this channel, you know, my hate for Wilson. But this idea that you can tell people how to think, that it's not enough that you act a certain way, I want you to think a certain way too. I understand what he was trying to get at, and you know, it just, to me, it just seems like the noble ideas in his mind that were so noble just weren't based in reality sometimes.
To this end, the government prohibited American banks from loaning money to any belligerent nation, an act that the then Secretary of State and noted gold hater William Jennings Bryan hoped would both cement American neutrality and bring the war to a speedy conclusion.
But the problem is William Jennings Bryan, who really did believe in legit neutrality for the United States, kind of butts heads with Wilson, because Wilson, while he's demanding neutrality in thought and deed from the Americans, his own governmental policies don't reflect that. And when Bryan protests about that, he ends up resigning because Wilson isn't willing to be that neutral.
One cannot fight with an empty war chest, after all. This fiscal neutrality was not long-lived, as President Wilson reversed the decision in 1915 in response to the British Empire indicating their stockpiles of cash were about to run out, and thus they could not afford to continue buying American goods. Though protesting its neutrality at each turn, the United States was all too keen to do business with the Entente.
Yep.
With the metaphorical floodgates opened, American creditors sent a veritable tsunami of greenbacks to the British Empire, who turned right around and spent that money in the United States.
I'm so glad he's showing this, because this just illustrates beautifully how the United States was not neutral during this war, no matter what Woodrow Wilson was claiming.
But the British were not the only foreign shoppers in American markets, as the German Empire too sought to buy critical supplies from Uncle Sam.
Sought to.
With the Western Front grinding to a stalemate, Germany hired ships from neutral countries to ferry food and other necessities purchased in the United States to the continent. But British naval supremacy and their blockade of Germany prevented much of it from getting through.
And here's where, if the U.S. was legitimately neutral, there should have been an issue with the British over this blockade. They should have said, listen, you can't stop us from trading with other nations, right? So the fact that the U.S. didn't push this issue definitely also shows their lack of neutrality.
The United States formally protested the British blockade in March of 1915, but the issue was quietly resolved in a meeting that saw the United States accept a British prohibition on selling food to Germany. When the blockade began impacting American cotton exports and threatening a vital pillar of the economy, Britain agreed to increase their cotton purchases to cover the shortfall. The upshot of all of this economic backroom dealing was an ostensibly neutral United States bowing to any small pressure from the British Empire to stop selling to Germany. Between 1914 to 1916, American trade with the German Empire plummeted by an economy-shattering 99%. Germany, backed to an economic wall, ordered a submarine blockade of Great Britain in retaliation. The United States protested, declaring this to be a violation of international law. This double standard, accepting a British blockade of Germany but not a German blockade of Britain, was acknowledged and waved away by President Wilson.
I love this guy. He's finally calling out the hypocrisy of the United States neutrality during this war. Love it.
Who claimed that the British Navy did not threaten American lives in the same way that Germany's powerful fleet of submarines did.
Well, no, because the U.S. wasn't in a situation where that was a concern, right? Oh my gosh. If the U.S. had actually tried to send ships to Germany, what might have happened then? At the very least, it would have been stopped and probably seized.
Wilson was unaware that Germany had only 9 submarines with which to enforce its blockade, hardly the mammoth threat to American life that he seemed to imagine. But the threat was still there.
And it's important to note, too, that early on, the U-boats didn't just start sinking neutral ships, right? They actually stopped them. They would surface, they would basically say, get off the ship. We're giving you a chance to get out of there. We don't want to kill anybody. We just want to prevent this cargo from getting to Great Britain. Of course, over time, that tactic needed to change because of how it was being responded to.
As the sinking of the Lusitania on March 7, 1915, would throw into sharp relief. The sinking of the RMS Lusitania, which killed 128 American citizens, was only one in a series of incidents that drove the American people further and further into the Entente camp. The American public, already displeased at reports of German atrocities in Belgium, condemned the apparent sinking of a civilian vessel, and a diplomatic back and forth between Washington and Berlin ensued.
Never mind the fact Lusitania was carrying war supplies. Anyway.
Calls to enter the war rang in the halls of the capital, stopped only by German promises to scale back their submarine operations. America was pacified for now, but German Americans began to face prejudice at home, prejudice that would only intensify as the war progressed.
And remember, at this time, more Americans self-identify as of German descent than any other group.
Doubts of German Americans' loyalty would be continuously raised, with President Wilson declaring that any man who carries a hyphen with him carries a dagger that he is ready to plunge into the vitals of this republic when he gets ready. A nakedly hostile remark towards the largest non-English speaking group in the United States at the time. Government-stoked and homegrown paranoia escalated into violence
And I've talked about that many times. I won't go into it again. There's lots of evidence, not only in the United States, but also in Britain, about the backlash toward Germans and people of German descent and names of German descent.
With German Americans shot, forced from their homes, or lynched, such as the case of Robert Paul Prager, a naturalized citizen who was lynched as a spy in April of 1918. This hatred was further stoked by an incredible act of sabotage. As previously mentioned, the Entente funneled much money to Yankee businesses, including munitions plants. Germany, unable to buy American weaponry thanks to the British blockade, began sending spies to find where the Entente was procuring.
Okay, this is kind of awesome.
To the British blockade, began sending spies to find where.
So I grew up playing, my first computer was a Commodore 64 back in the late 80s. Mid to late 80s, and one of my favorite games to play on the Commodore 64 was Spy vs. Spy, and that's one of the spies from that game. Oh, that's so cool, man. There's so much nostalgia here right now. I love it.
Where the Entente was procuring and transporting weapons and munition, and to halt the flow of materiel, if possible. One such point of departure was Black Tom Island in New York Harbor. And on July 30th, 1916, German agents decided to have a little fireworks show. Igniting over $20 million worth of stockpile munitions, the Germans created one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. A shockwave equivalent to a magnitude 5 earthquake was felt as far away as Philadelphia. The Statue of Liberty was damaged, and Black Tom Island was devastated. 110 by 50 meter crater left behind by the blast.
Something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough in discussing the chain of events that lead to the United States entry into the war. We talk about the Lusitania all the time, and we talk about the Zimmerman telegram all the time, but we don't talk about the Black Tom explosion, which was a legit act of destruction by German agents in the United States that caused a ton of damage. It was a big deal at the time, and it was all over the news.
Momentum was steadily building for the United States to enter the war. And in a display of military acumen that would make von Bismarck proud, German planners determined that the best way to keep the United States from entering wars was to actively target their merchant shipping and threaten American lives. Their rationale was simple: bringing back unrestricted submarine warfare and sinking every ship headed to Britain, American or not, would starve the Entente into submission and end the war before the United States could even be moved to intervene.
Which they had to do because the situation is also steadily declining in Germany because of the effects of the blockade. Here's the thing. The unrestricted submarine warfare in the end killed a tiny, like a minuscule fraction of the number of civilians that were killed by the British blockade of Germany. I mean, it's not even comparable. I mean, we're talking like probably less than 1% of deaths between the two happened on the Allied side. It was so much more destructive. But hey, the victors get to write the history, and they write the history of the evils of unrestricted submarine warfare, not the evils of this blockade that killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians.
American ships were sunk, but President Wilson, just barely re-elected, continued to demur, instead proclaiming armed neutrality by ordering American ships to be armed and authorized to fire on any aggressor. As their ships were raided and more were lost, the American public began clamoring for more than just armed neutrality. President Wilson continued to resist, but his efforts were ended by the infamous Zimmerman telegram, an order by the German foreign minister to his men in Mexico to court America's southern neighbor with promises of recovering territory in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if they would invade the United States for the Central Powers.
Now you have to remember that this is right around a time when there's been conflict between the U.S. and Mexico. There's a lot of bad blood happening here. Mexico's gone through kind of a civil war. You've got Pancho Villa leading raids into the United States. John Pershing, George Patton, and others are sent down for what's called the Mexican Punitive Expedition, where U.S. troops go into Mexico before the U.S. enters the war. And that's a whole story in and of itself. My wife's great grandfather was one of the soldiers in a PA cavalry unit that went down to the border for all of that. And so there's a lot of this going on. So it was a very natural thing for the Germans to see Mexico as a potential distraction for the United States to cause war. It makes sense if you're German and you're looking at this. It just didn't have the desired effect. And the problem is that Germany really lost the propaganda war from the very beginning in this war, going all the way back to the stuff that happens in Belgium during the initial invasion, to the stuff like with the unrestricted submarine warfare, the Black Tom explosion. Germany just continually is on the losing end of the propaganda war.
President Wilson, faced with all of these pressures, asked his cabinet for advice and found a single word on all of his advisors' lips. Both houses of the United States Congress passed resolutions supporting a war on Germany, and President Wilson formally requested Congress acknowledge a state of war had been created by Germany's actions rather than declare war outright. Congress responded by declaring war outright on April 6, 1917. Neutrality had ended, and it was time to go over there.
Back to Belleau Wood. Now, it's important to note that even before the U.S. is involved as a nation in the war, there are Americans fighting in Europe, going all the way back to 1914. There were Americans that were fighting in the French Foreign Legion. There were Americans that were fighting in French uniform as pilots. In fact, the French formed the Lafayette Escadrille, which is a unit of American pilots that are fighting for the French. And some of them are killed. Got to visit some of their graves when I were over there. So Americans have been fighting and dying in the war since the beginning.
The United States that entered the First World War was far from a military power. Isolationism had taken its toll on America's armed forces, leaving President Wilson to call up a minuscule standing army and dust off a navy of aging battleships.
Theodore Roosevelt had done a lot to start building up the Navy so that the U.S. could start to project its power around the world, the whole time of imperialism. And this is a time when the U.S. has grabbed Hawaii and the Philippines and Puerto Rico and fought the Spanish-American War, and they set up the base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. So there's a lot of that going on. But yeah, he's right. The situation in 1917 is far from ideal, which is why, even though war's declared in April 1917, you don't really see significant military action by the Americans in Europe for another year.
This, in a way, suited the president just fine, as Wilson believed the simple act of entering the war would tip the balance of power firmly in the favor of the Entente.
Not wrong.
While the British and French clamored for a fight to the finish, Wilson had his gaze fixed firmly on bringing the Germans to the negotiating table, and truly making this the war to end all wars. With the passage of the Selective Service Act, widespread conscription swelled the Americans' numbers. 2 million men had volunteered at the outbreak of war, and conscription would see 2.8 million more go over there.
Which is interesting because you never see nearly that many Americans actually involved in combat during the war.
Volunteers or conscripts, Yankee troops began making their way to Europe. American troops landed on European shores in June of 1917. British and French commanders initially viewed the newly arrived Americans as reinforcements they could use to supplement their dwindling numbers.
Yep.
Some black soldiers, including the famous Harlem Hellfighters, were folded into the French army for the duration of the war.
So Harlem Hellfighters, 369th Infantry, they're a New York National Guard unit originally. Probably the best unit of the war. Love their story. I cannot believe it hasn't been made into a movie yet. It would basically be Glory, but World War I. The Americans do not see black soldiers as equal to white soldiers in terms of their abilities. So they basically get folded into the French because the French are willing to use them. So they have French weapons and French helmets, and they're put under French command. But they fight so well. They never lose any ground. They never lose a man captured during the war. It takes many, many years, but eventually some of the first actions for which a Medal of Honor are awarded for the war go to men like Henry Johnson of the Harlem Hellfighters. Well-deserved Medal of Honor. But yeah, there's a lot of that goes on. And it's funny because General Pershing, who was often seen as someone who was very favorable to black soldiers, is very reluctant to put Americans under command of French or British generals, but he has no problem letting them have the black soldiers.
But General John Blackjack Pershing, infamous pacifier of the Philippines and commander of the American Expeditionary Force, sought to keep his men together in a unified American army.
Yep.
Pershing would largely get his way, and the first major engagement fought by the Americans would come the following summer, the Battle of Cantigny. A German salient at the village of Cantigny represented a golden opportunity to Pershing, who committed the 1st Infantry Division, better known as the Big Red One, to wipe it out.
Now, Pershing and other generals had made the same mistake. Comes in as the American, guns blazing. I don't care what you guys have been doing for 3 years. I don't care what lessons you think you've learned. We're going to come in and show you how it's done. And they make some of the exact same mistakes that have been made for the last 3 years. Kind of going in, guns blazing, really not grasping the nature of this war, at least not at first.
This strike would not only consolidate Entente lines, but Pershing hoped seeing the Americans in action would boost French confidence in their American comrades. At 6:45 a.m. on May 28, 1918, American infantry advanced under cover of French artillery. French tanks and flamethrower detachments advanced alongside the Yanks, and the combined force advanced up the slopes of Cantigny. Despite the help of the French gunners, tankers, and air support, the Americans were mauled during the uphill battle, yet they succeeded in capturing the village. German counterattacks began not long thereafter, but the Americans held firm, turning back 2 days of offensives and keeping a firm grip on Cantigny. The Americans accomplished their objective of not only taking the village, but also demonstrating that they could be counted on in a scrap. That scrap would come at Belleau Wood. A German offensive punched a hole in French lines, and the U.S. Marines were sent to plug the gap.
So this is right at the end of what's known as the Spring Offensive or the Kaiserschlacht Offensive, which was actually a series of offensive actions by the Germans. This is their last-ditch attempt to break through. They're hoping to kind of drive a wedge between the British lines and the French lines where they come together, isolate the French and the British from each other, force a negotiated peace before the Americans can arrive in force. And Belleau Wood is kind of at the tail end of this, and this is kind of the high water mark for the Germans as they're trying to push back toward Paris again.
Pushing back the German assault and repelling numerous attempts to reopen the hole. From there, the Marines assaulted critical German positions in and around Belleau Wood, taking heavy casualties but accomplishing their objectives. It was among the trees of Belleau that Marine lore could be written. Captain Williams' refusal to retreat has become the motto of the 5th Marines.
Yep.
But Belleau Wood and Cantigny were only the prelude to the largest offensive in American military history, to
the Muse Argon offensive. But and it's important to note here too that obviously Marines, and I love you Marines. We're very proud of our Marines here in the U.S. The Marines did not get the nickname Devil Dogs at Belleau Wood. That's just one of many of those aspects of lore that come out of World War I, like the ladies in Ladies from Hell that is given to the Black Watch, which also wasn't given by the Germans. The name Devil Dogs came from Americans. It appeared in print months before Belleau Wood happened, but it's a cool story.
To that point, from September 26th to November 11th, 1.2 million American troops embarked on the Meuse-Argonne offensive, aimed at capturing the railhead at Sedan. The offensive hit immediate stumbling blocks, as the Americans deployed inexperienced units already weakened by the Spanish flu.
which the Americans brought over. That was the great gift of the American people to Europe, was bringing Spanish flu among the soldiers as they came to the front.
The battle dragged on. Both the Americans and the French sent troops to shore up the line. The Entente spirits would be lifted by an incredible act of heroism. Corporal Alvin York, a sharpshooting infantryman from the 82nd Infantry, now the 82nd Airborne, killed 25 and captured 132 Germans, a feat that would earn him the Medal of Honor. In a bid to break the stalemate, the Big Red One assaulted the German stronghold at Côte du Châtillon, an imposing position that American Lieutenant General Robert Bullard described thus: "Not a line, a net, 4 kilometers deep. Wire interlaced knee-high in grass. Wire tangled devilishly in forests. Pillboxes in succession, one covering another.
Brutal.
No foxhole cover for gunners here, but concrete masonry. Bits of trenches, more wire, a few light guns. Defense in depth."
Defense in depth is that brilliant idea that the Germans have, where they have multiple layers of trenches. It's used by both sides by the end of the war, but the Germans are the ones that first really kind of develop it. When they fall back to their Hindenburg line, they make heavy use of this. Thin front line that kind of absorbs the initial attack, draws the enemy away from its base of supply and artillery and everything that can help it, and then strong second and third lines where you can counterattack and destroy the attack that's already been weakened by the time it gets there.
The mighty First was repulsed by this net, but their loss was quickly avenged by your friend and mine, Douglas MacArthur of the 42nd Rainbow Division, a patchwork of National Guard troops from states from Iowa to Alabama. The Guardsmen were able to succeed where the Big Red One failed, cracking Côte du Châtillon and turning the tide of the offensive, just in time for the armistice to be signed on November 11th.
And most likely, the very last soldier to be killed on the Western Front was Henry Gunther, who was an American, who knew that the war was about to come to a stop at 11 o'clock, and at 10:59 gets killed by a German machine gun crew who were begging him to stop charging at them and shooting at them, waving him off, trying to stop it, because everybody knew the armistice had been signed hours earlier. But it didn't take effect. The Germans wanted it to take effect immediately, but the Allies did not. And the Allies did not because they wanted to keep attacking. So they launched attacks that morning, knowing the armistice was taking effect at 11 o'clock. Thousands of men became casualties in attacks where their commanding officers knew the war was about to be over and it was about to stop at that time. And Gunther had been demoted, and he was trying to kind of redeem himself, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew exactly what was happening when he made that choice.
America would prove as active in peace as they were in the final days of the war. President Wilson brought his 14 points to the negotiations at Versailles and pushed for these principles to provide the bedrock for the post-war world. Wilson envisioned a League of Nations that would promote global peace and provide a diplomatic alternative to fighting. Wilson also sought to impose his peaceableness on Europe as a whole, dismantling the old colonial system and promoting self-determination for all peoples across the world. But Wilson's ideas were not universally accepted, with the previously mentioned Secretary of State Lansing remarking that promoting self-determination would raise hopes which can never be realized, and that the phrase is simply loaded with dynamite.
One of the problems that Woodrow Wilson has is that he's got his ideas, right? And he says, this is the way it's going to be. He doesn't really leave a lot of wiggle room. And that gets him into trouble because people realize that he's not really somebody who's willing to negotiate. He comes in with his ideas, and it has to be that way. He won't accept anything less. And he's not really, I guess a pragmatist is a good way to look at it. Like, he doesn't really read the room and understand what's possible. He's such an idealist that when he sets the goal and the bar way up here, he's not willing to accept right here. And so then you end up getting something far less than what could have been possible because he won't negotiate, he won't compromise.
The British and French were equally skeptical, with the French representative only reading Wilson's points when the German delegation requested that they be the basis of the peace talks. Fearing that the Americans and Germans would conclude a separate peace based on Wilson's ideas, the French and British accepted the 14 points as Germany requested. Wilson became quite popular for his peacemaking image, and his League of Nations was formally established in 1920. But neither the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the First World War, nor the United States' entry into the League of Nations were approved by Congress, a sign that isolationism had returned to America's shores.
But again, this was an issue of lack of compromise. Wilson probably could have gotten the Senate to approve the treaty, to join the League of Nations, if he had been willing to compromise, and he just wasn't.
America's war was over, for now. Participation in the war to end all wars brought America onto the world stage in an unprecedented fashion, but the public's desire to return to a quiet isolation dashed any hopes that President Wilson had of his country leading the world into a new era of peace and international cooperation. The League of Nations would go on to crumble under the weight of its members' indifference to its decisions, specifically the open defiance of the Japanese Empire in the 1930s. German Americans came out of the war browbeaten into hiding their culture and assimilating. While before the war, a full quarter of American high school students studied the German language, by 1918, only 1% of high schools even had German offered as a class.
Yep.
Ultimately, it would take another world war and a new president to see Lady Liberty take the center stage in world affairs again.
That was good. He did a good job with that. Very, very impressed. That was good stuff. So I'm going to put a link in the description, and I'll throw it up here on the screen as well, so that you can actually see my entire playlist of World War I videos, both original content and also reactions, and you can kind of pick and choose other ones that you'd like to watch. Like I said, invite you to check out Armchair Historian if you haven't already. He's got a lot of great stuff, and he does good work. So thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.